Hello, and thanks for clicking play on the Tour of the DC Universe podcast. I'm one of your hosts, the real Brad Bell. Just wanted to put a precursor before we get into this episode, which is a Batman character spotlight and covers Crisis on Infinite Earths 1 through 3 of that 12-part legendary series. This was originally intended during this recording to be a brand new podcast. Jerry had done coverage of the Legends miniseries here on the Confirmed Epic podcast, the Epic Review Radio Network, back in the day, and we said, hey, let's reboot this, let's make it its own podcast. We made it on Instagram, we made it its own YouTube channel. It was a whole big deal. You've probably seen some of it. Well, after some discussion between Jerry and I, we decided it would be best for this podcast and the podcasting future of the Epic Review Podcast Network if we just continued this as a bonus pod on the Epic Review Podcast Network. So it will be in the same feed of something like the Confirmed Epic Podcast as opposed to just having its own feed. It may take us a little longer to get through this DC content. We'll come to it as we see fit. But it just gives us a lot more flexibility in podcasting. We're not restricted to just DC. We can do Marvel. We can do indie stuff. We can do Star Wars stuff. And just everything in between the geek sphere. So I just wanted to throw that out there. If you were really looking forward to this podcast, it's not dead. And even though you will hear as you go through this podcast that this is episode 1, not really. It's kind of episode 2 because it follows Jerry's work on Legends. So that's why you will see it titled episode 2, even though it's referenced as episode 1. So I hope that doesn't confuse anybody. This is just going to be a continuation of what Jerry did with Legends, and we're going to go from there. Thank you. Enjoy the show.
Where do we begin?
Welcome, fellow members of DC U Nation, to the very first episode of a brand new podcast, Tour of the DC Universe. This is a monthly podcast taking you through every major DC Comics event, from Crisis on Infinite Earths to, hopefully, present. I'm one of your hosts, the real Brad Bell, and joining me tonight is not just a partner, but a friend, a man I'm going to deem the doctor of DC, because he has a lot more knowledge about it than most people I know. Not saying he's a end-all, be-all source.
I am not.
But the one, the only, Jerry Reed, also known as
Barbecue 17. What's going on, everybody?
Thanks so much, Jerry, for agreeing to do this new monthly podcast. I couldn't think of anybody else I would rather have by my side as we start this new monthly podcasting adventure. And I know you're a busy man, being a father, a husband. You work 2 jobs, and I have 2 kids and a wife, and still working. So I thought it would be best to make this a monthly podcast format.
Monthly works fine with me.
So the idea is that this podcast will drop on iTunes the last Thursday of each month. Let's talk about what a tour of the DC Universe is. Jerry actually did a version of this show on our old podcast feed, the Confirmed Epic Podcast, where he picked up with Legends, which was an event following Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, Jerry put a ton of painstaking research, right, Jerry?
I did. I was talking to my wife earlier, telling her about this, and I said, I really started it at one point when we weren't podcasting a lot, and the Tour of the DC Universe was going to be my personal podcast. It was almost more like a lecture. I mean, it was when it's a solo podcast, you're either ranting, you're telling a story, or you're giving information, you're giving a lecture. And so that was really what I was trying to do, was like give a lecture, a tour of all of the major events, all the crossovers. That was kind of my criteria originally, was if it was a crossover that was like more than 2 issues and more than I think my criteria was like it had to be more than 2 books for more than 2 issues. And that was what I was using as my criteria.
So I looked at that podcast and I said, how can we take the best of that podcast, but maybe make it more interesting? Not that it wasn't, but as far as a discussion between 2 friends and lovers of DC Comics.
I'm glad you added up DC Comics on there, Brad. So.
Yeah. Friends, lovers of DC
Partners.
Comics.
No, anyways, like I said, I really at the time when I did that, I mean, there was so much stuff coming out that was really, harkening back to some of these big events in DC history, and everybody talks about Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's pretty well known. You get to Nightfall, that's a pretty well known event, but. I started looking at and trying to find copies of, Legends and Millennium and Invasion and some of these big
hard.
DC events that, I mean, they're getting better. Actually, DC does a really good job of keeping their books in print. I will say that is one of the best things I can say about their publishing is that they really do a pretty good job of keeping things in print, keeping things out there. But I was like, that's kind of a fun way to look at the history. And of course, calling it the Tour of the Universe, DC Universe, was a play on the book History of the DC Universe, which is a very interesting book. It's not a traditional comic, but it was released after Crisis to kind of help everyone figure out what things looked like.
It's actually included in the 35th anniversary edition as far as the deluxe hardcover. So that was in there. I did check that out. Maybe we'll discuss that down the line. Maybe not, because it's
I think that could be a one-issue thing. It's not terribly long, but it's not terribly long, but it's interesting. See, I have the single, the single trade, and the Crisis book that I'm using is the one from 2000.
The Millennium, I actually ordered the single issues of that on eBay for like $10. I got all 8, so that was a snag.
I had a couple of the single issues of Millennium floating around
somewhere in the multiverse. Hopefully, you can find those. So what is this kind of incarnation of the show going to be? As kind of mentioned in the intro, our goal is to break down every major DC Comics event, starting with the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, starting in 1985, all the way to present, which if we got there now, which would be a decade, the rate we're going to go, would be Dark Knight Death Metal, Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo. We'll see if we ever get there, Jerry.
I mean, I think the whole Nightfall Night's End is going to take us about 3 years.
Probably. And I wouldn't mind that.
That's probably one of my favorite big events. Of anything.
What I want to say here too is we are going to cover chronologically these events, but that's not to say we won't interlude some kind of character arcs and some runs that we may find interesting, just kind of to mix things up. But it is going to focus on DC. So if you're not a big DC Comics fan, maybe we can interest you enough to pick up one of these trades. That's kind of my hope. Another thing we want to do, so the first half of the show is dedicated to breaking down those issues, but the second half is a hero or villain spotlight. We're going to rotate each month. Tonight will be a hero spotlight on the one and only Caped Crusader, Batman, in which we just have a general discussion about versions of it, about different costumes we like, just wherever that conversation takes us, Jerry. And I know we could talk much longer than 45 minutes on Batman.
We could talk 10 years on Batman. Yeah.
We absolutely...
We kind of have been talking for Batman about 10 years. And
over 10 years. I met Jerry. Actually, my first meeting of Jerry goes back to something DC related. It was at the midnight showing of Watchmen. Do you remember this, Jerry?
I do.
Zack Snyder's Watchmen. So
it's a very good movie. I still think it's a really well done take on that, on a book that was a book that was always called unfilmable. So, and
another thing I want to do over the course of the lifespan of this podcast, which I hope is very long, is to put some movie review interludes as far as DC movies, Batman 89, the original Superman, Watchmen, stuff like that, just to kind of mix it up, and I feel confident you would find that entertaining.
As long as it's not Batman and Robin.
Okay, well, we've already done Batman Forever, Rip Joel Schumacher, on our old podcast. Now, the stuff I'm going to mention here in the intro of the show is usually stuff I would mention in the outro, but since this is the first episode of this podcast, let's kind of get it out of the way. You can find this podcast on iTunes by searching A Tour of the DC Universe. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, at DCU Tour Pod. Reach us by email, dcutourpod@gmail.com. So, Jerry, let's go ahead and get into the big event of this podcast, which is Crisis on Infinite Earths. This is 12 issues. We originally talked about, let's do 6 this episode, 6 the next. Then let's do 4, 8, 12. We're like, nope. Jerry, we ended up deciding, thanks to your, I think, smart recommendation, that we're going to break this down on 3 issues. So kind of break it up in the quarters almost. So we'll cover the first 3 tonight. Next episode, 4 through 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we may be on this to November. We'll see how things shake out. So, Jerry, you mentioned you were reading the 2000 edition. I read this as far as the 35th anniversary deluxe hardcover. My wife, Abby, got me for Father's Day. Much appreciated. How I kind of came to know Crisis as it, and I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first mega line-wide crossover at Marvel RDC. And now, I don't mean event. There's been events. There's been series. But this book, and you mentioned this in your previous incarnation before we rebooted of the podcast, this event spanned every DC title. Am I correct?
It pretty much did. I mean, obviously, Crisis takes that name from some Crisis events that happened in the Silver Age.
Like Crisis on Multiple Earths, was that
Crisis
one
on Multiple Earths, where essentially the Golden Age characters in DC would get together and join up with the Silver Age cast. And it kind of became a tradition that it would happen every now and then. But again, when we're talking about comics in the, Golden Age, Silver Age, even maybe early Bronze Age, the continuity is very loose. Things often happen. Things are rewritten on the fly. You have a lot of retconning going on. And, I mean, part of that is because older comics were really considered disposable. I mean, it was you were pretty hardcore if you were holding on to your comics, if you were actually like going back and, looking things up.
Which is what makes those books so valuable now, because it was disposable. Which is what makes
them so valuable. There's not, millions of them sitting around like with 90s comics and even a lot of the 80s comics too. And so, things were really convoluted. Now, I wanted to say real quick, you said about, Secret Wars. I just wanted to mention Secret Wars briefly, and here's me talking about a Marvel comic,
which is crazy. Okay, go ahead.
So Secret Wars came out, a couple years prior. While Secret Wars didn't really fully cross over to everything Marvel did, it definitely laid a little bit more groundwork for this kind of, large event than I think a lot of people give it credit for. But do you know where the idea for Secret Wars comes from?
I do not know. I know it was a toy line.
It was. Mattel was really wanting to push their way into the superhero market. At the time, Mattel had Masters of the Universe, which was doing very well. I mean, this would have been around 84. Masters came out in 82. And now I'm going to talk about Masters of the Universe the whole rest of the podcast. No, I'm just kidding. Which is a DC comic now.
DC. Yeah.
No. So Mattel, realized that Kenner, who was one of the big rival companies at the time, that they had the DC license, that they were doing superpowers. And Mattel really wanted to have something on hand in case superheroes was the next big trend. And so they pitched an idea, and it's really funny if you read Jim Shooter from Marvel talking about that basically, I mean, Secret Wars is called Secret Wars because Mattel did all this testing with kids, and they like the name Secret, and they like the name Wars, and so they put it together. And, you know, they like this idea of having all these heroes together, you know, because it was more toys to sell. It was all like, mostly A-list characters, and Kang. Kang's in it too. But, I mean, there were things like Doctor Doom was redesigned because kids thought he looked too medieval, so he was made to look more robotic. And but Secret Wars did not cross over in the same way that Crisis on Infinite Earths does. And it does not have, here's the word you like, Brad, it really doesn't have the same stakes. What do you think's the most significant thing that came out of Secret Wars?
It is the black suit Spider-Man.
It is the black suit Spider-Man. And not that's not a big deal, but, I mean, Crisis on Infinite Earths, you know, absolutely changed, I mean, everything about DC Comics at the time. It was a really, really big deal. And you recently acquired a copy of the Crisis on Infinite... I'm tongue-tied. The Crisis on Infinite Earths Omnibus, the first volume, right, of all the tie-ins?
The companion piece, yeah.
The companion,
that
yeah.
Jerry, that Jerry sold to me at a great price. The companion one.
So, I think one of the things that is really interesting is when you read about some of the creators going into that book, like All-Star Squadron, that knew that Crisis was going to be the end of their title. That Crisis was going to get rid of their characters, to like wipe them out of existence.
Yeah, Roy Thomas.
Did you read that part in the book yet?
I did. I was going to bring it up. Roy Thomas, specifically, he was writing All-Star Squadron, which kind of it had JSA members, but it wasn't just all original JSA members. There were crossovers between people like Captain Marvel, a.k.a. Shazam now, and of course Superman and stuff like that. But he was opposed to this line-wide crossover because it was like, hey, we're getting rid of these Golden Age characters. JSA was introduced in the Golden Age, correct?
Oh, yeah, so, JSA, that's the Golden Age.
So we're going to get rid of these characters that you love so much. So it wasn't, while I feel like everybody by the time these started coming out was on board at DC with Crisis on Infinite Earths, I imagine it was a pretty tough sell in those offices at the time.
It really was. I would honestly, I mean, not that comics haven't always had editors, but there's some you can find some really interesting stuff that that Marv Wolfman talks about, where, you know, they deliver these things about, you know, people need to use like the character of the Monitor, you know, so many times within, you know, the next like 6 issues or 12 issues or something for their books, you know, to kind of build up these characters and build towards this. So it was definitely one of those, you know, maybe earliest things where not just editors saying like, you know, we want this character, we want this storyline, we don't like that storyline, but really where everything was being directed together towards one event. While I was doing some research and reading about this, I actually found a term. One of the big things about Crisis is you have red skies. Mm-hmm. This is kind of a big deal. I think you said in the new, was it the Arrowverse just did like a Crisis? They did like their own Crisis.
They did.
And they have like did they use Knox from 89 Batman talking about the red skies?
Yep, they did. That was the very first scene, I believe, of that crossover.
So
awesome.
So one of the big directives was that all of the books would have red skies at a certain point, you know, to kind of, again, sell that this big event is happening all across the DC universe. I had never heard this term, but there's a term, it's a little bit of a, you know, dismissive term, where something is called a red skies crossover, which is basically like a tie-in book or tie-in series where like hardly anything happens, but, you know, of relevance to the main storyline, but the book is still labeled as being part of a giant crossover, which is a way to sell more books too.
Which is in Companion 2, which I had started reading before I got the first one. Now I jump back to the first one that you got me. That is the first issue. It's like part 6 of a Detective Comics storyline, but the only tie-in to Crisis on Infinite Earths in that Batman. No, sorry, it's Batman, I believe. The only tie-in is Red Skies. That's it. Nothing significant to this event.
While Batman is obviously a big part of Crisis, Batman is the major DC character that honestly changes the least with Crisis. I mean, there's really not a whole lot of...
And I feel like there's cool stuff early on with Batman kind of interacting with Flash. Kind of reminds you...
he's there.
Yeah, he's kind of just there, and you never say that about Batman, but this was such a cosmic level event that he was, I don't want to say sidelined, but he was pushed to the side, especially for the two Superman. The Earth 2 Superman.
I think the issue is Batman is not terribly problematic overall with DC. I mean, when you get into it, you can find where Marv Wolfman talks about this, but I mean, he had this idea for a long time of doing a giant crossover event. I mean, he talks about having this idea as a kid, with this this character called the Librarian, that eventually he calls him the Monitor, but as a kid in his mind, this idea was always this character named the Librarian. But, I mean, the idea was to make things easier for people to read, that people were sending in letters and asking questions about continuity errors in DC. I mean, there was all kinds of, it was hard to keep up with everything. DC had multiple Earths.
And Marvel had kind of been kicking their butt a little bit in the publishing
Marvel
game.
had been. Yeah, this was definitely a lower time for DC.
For sure. But post this, they really pick up. You get things like the John Byrne Superman. You get things like Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns. It does usher in basically the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
So I think this is kind of, for a lot of people, the end of the Silver Age. Then Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, that stuff, you're in the Bronze Age.
A lot of Frank Miller stuff is going on at this point, though. If you look in Marvel, at about the same time, Frank Miller is doing his run on Daredevil.
Which is going to be the precursor for what he does with Year One and Dark Knight.
Yeah, that is a good point. But Crisis really brings in like a modern era of comics where, all these things are working together, building up to something that's way bigger than, you would initially think.
So two things before we actually get into kind of discussing the issues. Marv Wolfman's the main writer of the book, and, of course, the great George Perez does the art for all the covers, all the interiors. Just, he worked his butt off on these issues, you can tell. Beautiful, especially about that time period. It kind of almost is a go-to example of what comics were like in the early to mid-'80s, I would say. Another thing I kind of want to highlight, piggyback off of what Jerry said, is the reason this book, I think, is so influential, even compared to Marvel's Secret Wars, which is also a great story, but is that it kind of set this path for the comics industries. It almost set the precedent, if you will, in the comics industry for, if we do want to do a reset, a big event's the way to do it, which is what you see time and time again, more with Marvel, ironically enough, than DC, although DC's done it with New 52 and with Rebirth and whatnot. But they'll do a big event, and then they'll usher in a bunch of new number ones. So this did set that precedent, for better or for worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, it's interesting to think that what's interesting to me is now when you think of DC Comics, I mean, their whole identity is multiverse. Everything's part of the multiverse. And Crisis, I mean, the whole intention is to do away with the multiverse. I mean, that's what they went into it, attempting to do. So it's kind of funny reading it in that context, too, looking back.
And real quick, let's talk about the term crisis, which is significant to DC. So there's been a few major crises. Obviously, this one is the biggest one. You have, I think, 0 Hour Crisis in Time, which is about Hal Jordan being Parallax. But the actual sequel to this is Infinite Crisis. And that's when the multiverse officially comes back into DC. And then you have the final crisis where Grant Morrison Darkseid acquires the anti-life equation, finally unleashes it and all that kind of stuff. But those are the major crises. You also have on a smaller level Identity Crisis, Heroes in Crisis, which are like more murder mysteries from Brad Meltzer and Tom King with the latter one there. So, Jerry, are we good to get into these first 3 issues?
I think we're definitely good to get in these first issues. So, April 1985. Turn on your time machine, Brad.
All right, turn on the time machine. I'm on my cosmic treadmill. I'm going back to
1985. I'm 1.5 years old.
You're 1.5. I'm not born because I'm born in March of '87. But I love.
So I am pre-crisis and you are post-crisis.
I got to put that. I need to put that in my Twitter bio. If ever this show becomes big enough to have shirts, that will be an idea. So. I love how this just brings you right into the action. Chaos. It sits, here we go, one of my favorite words again. It sits the stakes of this story as cosmic, as this grandiose, bigger than anything we've seen up until that point in DC. And then you have a character known as Pariah arrive. Jerry, what do you think of the Pariah character? Because I liked him a lot.
Pariah is so incredibly expressive. You have, George Perez and Jerry Ordway won, for a while there was an award called the Jack Kirby Award, and they won for Best Art Team in 1986 for Crisis. And, so all the characters are very expressive in these books, but Pariah, especially his eyes, are so expressive and emotive as you're seeing what's going on, but then you're seeing his facial expressions, and I think it amplifies it for you.
He is
about the horror that you're experiencing.
He is the audience's surrogate during this whole crossover event. You're kind of seeing things through his eyes, not every page, but as far as feeling not just the scale, but the tragedy of this event, the lives being lost. He almost acts as a type of, to compare with Marvel, like a Herald of Galactus type character. Right. So
that's a great way to put it. And the same way with Crisis, with the style of writing, you're constantly being transported to different times, different, multiverses, different, different Earths. And like Pariah, you're kind of always trying to figure out where you are. Although I think this book does a really good job of keeping you connected.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's so easy. Oh, go ahead.
When he arrives on the scene, though, you know that all hell's about to break loose. Sorry, Jerry. Continue with that point.
No, I was going to say, one of the things, just starting this, it is, it's chaos and you're trying to understand what's going on. You have those effects of when you're seeing these, these different Earths being wiped out. It's very shocking using that, those simple stark white backgrounds, having the characters kind of like losing color and disappearing in the lines. But it's really effective. It's really effective to make you feel that something is really happening here.
Jack Kirby was the first to kind of show motion in comics, like Thor swinging his hammer and things of that nature. But this is almost the full evolution, I feel like, of that Kirby style, because you're able to see motion on the pages, but on a planetary scale.
Yes. It's so easy. I think in a lot of modern comics, you see, energy and destruction and, your mystical effects. And it's so easy sometimes to have those things blur into just being meaningless. Just having so much stuff happening that's just meaningless. But I feel like with Crisis that everything is super clear. Everything is legible. You can always tell what's going on.
And that is such a testament to the quality of Perez's work here, because there's so much going on. It would be easy for the reader to get lost with all this chaos, but you never feel that. It flows well.
Yes, characters stand out. I mean, unless you just don't know who a character is, which, I mean, it happens, you always know who you're looking at. You always know who's speaking. We've talked about this before, I think. Did we talk about this, or did I talk about this in the Legends podcast? But about how I think it was Marv Wolfman that actually had to work to ensure that each character sounded like that character. That they had the voice in the way that they spoke. I
think that was on the Legends podcast.
Might be the Legends podcast. Then that might have been for Legends then. But you think about writing is, that many characters who had regular creative teams as well.
And speaking of the characters, I'm going to deem these the big three of the Crisis on Infinite Earths. You have Alexander Luthor, and you have Lila, a.k.a. Harbinger. And Alexander Luthor, no relation to Lex Luthor, as is mentioned in this book. What Earth is he from? Earth 3? I can't remember.
I think
he's from Earth 3. But
I'm having to look back. I thought Earth 3 was where the
Earth 3 is
that's where that's where the not Injustice League. Oh my gosh, Ultraman and
what's the Crime
Johnny
Syndicate,
Quick and all
the
Crime Syndicate.
Yeah.
Crime Syndicate.
So, but what you see here is he is sent away from Earth 3, and he grows rapidly. And I really like how you have almost the empathy of Harbinger, you have the intelligence of Alexander Luthor, and then you have the just sheer emotion of Pariah. And I think when you put those three characters together as the ones that are dealing the most with the Monitor and eventually the Anti-Monitor, it really moves the story along at a decent pace. I never felt like, even though this is 12 issues, and this is a lot of word bubbles here, this isn't like reading a modern comic. It takes you a bit to really take it in. But I never felt like it got kind of slogged down there.
I'm always amazed every time. I read through Crisis every couple, probably every 2 or 3 years I read through it again. And I'm always impressed by how quickly you can read it. But again, about how much you really do have to read it. It's not just splash pages and, grunts and sound effects and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of writing in it.
One of my favorite characters in this book, which I believe is going to be our focus of our villain spotlight in the next episode, that could change, but it is the Psycho Pirate, which there's been different incarnations of this character. I believe at least 2. The one we have here is Roger Hayden. Now, we don't need to do a deep dive on Psycho Pirate right now. We can save that for next episode. But Jerry, kind of give the audience just a brief overview of the Psycho Pirate and his powers.
The Psycho Pirate uses he has trouble, he feels emotions in a crippling way, but when he uses the Medusa mask, he's able to control the emotions and essentially make others feel the emotions in a very strong way. Which, one of the best things he does is he makes Killer Frost essentially fall in love with Firestorm.
Which in
hilarious.
The Flash TV show is how that show starts out. Is Caitlin Snow who's in love with Firestorm, which is crazy to say.
It's hilarious in this one, though. I mean, my favorite part of it is when they're sitting there and Firestorm's saying all this stuff, and he finally looks over and he's like, "And quit nibbling on my ear." I mean,
they do have good banter back and forth.
There really is a lot of good banter. I mean, it's a great blend of some of the playfulness of the Silver Age comics with the seriousness and the story of a more modern comics. So I love it.
So Psycho Pirate's going to be a huge pawn here for the Anti-Monitor throughout the course of this whole story.
He is, and he's picked up initially. I mean, the initial idea with, Harbinger is going around collecting these various heroes and villains that the Monitor wants to form this team.
Which are sometimes called, in the TV show, they called them Paragons. I didn't see that referenced in this book, so.
I did not see that referenced here either. We recently watched with my daughter Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and I know Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is like, 88, 89, so it's a couple years after this. But, in the plot of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, I mean, they're going around and capturing these historical figures through time to bring them back for a school project. And as I was reading this, it made me think about that. That's like Harbinger. That's what she's doing, is she's going around just like grabbing these characters out of their contexts and, Arion, the Lord of Atlantis, and just like, pulling them back to the Monitor satellite for this, this special mission. So I thought it was kind of funny.
And she's going through time and space, because you see jumping back and forth in time and the different Earths, of course. The end splash page, pretty cool. You get to see the first reveal of the Monitor on a big splash page at the very last of this issue, the very end of this issue, rather. I kind of put here in the show notes this maybe the new standard or the first standard for all-knowing bald men in media, like Zordon from Power Rangers, like that type of person.
Yeah.
That was my vibe, kind of being a kid that grew up in the 90s. But the Monitor, he's important to this story, but he doesn't play the role, again, spoilers for all this stuff, he doesn't play the role necessarily that you think he's going to have. He dies during the first half of this book, right?
Yeah.
I think it's issue 4.
It's interesting. I mean, he seems, and he's been built up so much that I think he appeared in New Teen Titans in like 1982. It's
really?
Like the first time he's mentioned. And so there was like these directives to start using this character at one point. But he was built up as a villainous character. It seemed like that he was working for some evil purposes. But and I looked this up. Do you know where he was first shown?
No.
He's first fully revealed here.
No, where was
he
first
shown in an issue of G.I. Combat.
Really?
One of DC's military series. Yeah, first place where you actually see him is in G.I. Combat.
Did that focus on the losers? That group of heroes
who show up?
Yeah.
Yep, who show up here in issue 3.
Okay, and then they're later kind of revamped for the Jock and Diggle Vertigo series. But let's move on to issue 2. I think the defining panels of this issue, and this is, I think, the best Batman we kind of get in this book. You get a few pages of Batman and Joker interacting. Joker's broken into some other billionaire's home. He's apparently just taking the guy hostage or robbing him blind, something of that nature.
He's a movie producer, or he was involved with movies, because there's a reference where Batman says, the only movie you're going to be is a sequel to The Prisoner. And I don't mean that one about the village, which is kind of as a little joke. Marv Wolfman claims to have gotten the idea for a short-term comic series. There was a British show called The Prisoner that was intended to be a very short run, had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that was what inspired him to do a comic like that someday. And so Batman actually makes a joke about it here. And
this Joker is a very, very iconic take on the character, because it is very similar to what you'll get with the Nicholson costume, with the top hat and the long coat, and just the Joker of that time, right?
I mean, this is what the Joker looked like probably through the late 70s into the, mid-late 70s into the, probably until the early 90s to some extent.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this is very, I would say the art is very close to licensing art depictions of DC characters. I mean, you look at it And this is the Batman you recognize. This is the Joker you recognize. This is the Firestorm you recognize. If you were at all familiar with these characters during that era.
It's the definitive designs of the characters for that
really
time
is.
period,
it
especially.
really is. These are what the Superpowers toys look like. When Mattel did their massive DC Universe Classics line that ran from about 2008 until off and on until last couple years, in different forms, most of their versions looked like characters from this era. I mean, they look like these definitive depictions of those characters.
Really, the biggest part of this issue is the first time you see Flash traveling through time to warn Batman of the coming crisis.
It's grotesque. I mean, just seeing him with like the lightning and the smoke coming off his body his body looks like contorted and warped.
Yeah.
And again, you see Batman's face when he says, like the Flash disintegrating before my eyes. I mean, Batman looks scared, which is not a usual, Batman facial expression that you see.
And he, again, with the facial expressions, the Perez art really shows that off. But another thing you don't usually see is Batman kind of run to Superman for help. Usually a Superman going to Batman, honestly.
As it should be.
But what you see in this issue is Batman has kind of sought out Superman. They're meeting on a rooftop. Pariah shows up, and then all hell breaks loose. But that kind of shows you the stakes of where we're at. And to go back to the Flash thing, very, very inspirational for Zack Snyder's BVS for when the Flash shows up in that vision, the Ezra Miller Flash, to Bruce Wayne, warning him before the whole desert night, the apocalypse nightmare scene.
Yeah,
but
there's a part where is it Superman who says something about talk about Batman, about hearing the fear in his voice? Is that Superman that says that?
I think so. I
mean, that is an interesting thing where he's like, I've never heard fear in his voice. I mean, that was this is unnerving to Bruce.
And Superman he's not going to say stuff to just show Batman up. Like, he genuinely feels this. Like, that's what you love or hate Superman. I've grown to love him over the past few years. But he's always a very genuine character.
I mean, Batman and Superman, the whole rivalry thing is when we're talking about Crisis on Infinite Earths, the rivalry thing is quite newer. I mean, they are confidants and friends.
Yeah, this is coming off of years and years of World's Finest comics spanning the Silver Age into the Bronze Age. So yeah, cool classic stuff there. You see the giant towers show up. These are towers that the Anti-Monitor has basically put in different Earths to be a defense system against the antimatter wave and the shadow creatures that are kind of going to serve as the henchmen. For the Anti-Monitor. This splash page, the design of that tower, the Great Disaster, again, just great scope and scale by Perez.
I like that Commandi's climbing it too. I mean, they really are just bringing in all kinds of, they really are bringing somebody from every corner of the DC universe here.
Yeah, which is what this event should be.
And you get that nice scene where, Commandi is rescued by the...
was it Solvar?
He's rescued by Solvar, but he's also rescued by the Earth 2 Superman. And you have that very classic, Superman, but who acknowledges that Commandi has probably come into contact with, another version of himself.
I kind of want to talk about the Earth 2 Superman maybe on the next episode a little more, but
sure.
He's such a very interesting character because he's a Superman he's been through it. He's seen it. Almost kind of reminds me of Frank Miller's Batman in The Dark Knight Returns. Not to that level of grimness, but just the experience factor there.
Yeah.
So,
or again, I mean, you have the Kingdom Come Superman.
Yeah, exactly.
Where there's a clear aging that's gone on, there's a clear experience and whatnot.
So let's kind of wrap up this discussion by getting to issue 3 here. I think one of the things you see early on in issue 3 is the inability of a lot of these street level characters to really act. I mean, you see like Nightwing, he's not doing. Is this Batman and the Outsiders, or is this the Teen Titans? What are we seeing?
So you have the new Teen Titans, and you have Batman and the Outsiders.
So it's
there.
both. It's both.
Yeah.
But you basically see it's Donna Troy, right?
Donna Troy, yeah. Donna Troy here.
Who is, what is she, Wonder Girl?
Wonder Girl.
Yeah. So she is doing a lot. Superman's here doing a lot. But I mean, again, Katana's doing some cool stuff. So is Black Lightning.
Starfire is like, she's shooting, her energy beams. And, Starfire, or Superman's like, hold your bolts. They have no effect.
There's a very good image if you have the deluxe hardcovers, page 78, where Batman's just standing back and his jaw is aghast when the Flash shows up again to be like,
yeah,
guys, this is bad. This is like for
right
real.
It's like right before Jericho, pushes him out of the way. And
then you see, go ahead, Jerry. Sorry.
I want to put out there's a scene in it's on page 77 of my version, and it sounds like our versions are pretty accurate page wise because you said 78 and I was on that page too, but it's page 8 of book 3. But it's when Donna Troy's trying to rescue all those people, and Nightwing sees it, and she can't hear him. And a building falls over on Donna Troy, and all of a sudden Superman comes in. You see his cape.
That's so awesome, dude.
My gosh, I'm sitting here thinking if this was the movie, this is the part where the Superman music swells. Dun, da, da, him coming up and brushing the rocks off his cape.
Like John Williams Superman music.
Oh my gosh, it's just like a really cool, iconic Superman. There, and just last minute there he is. So
that is quintessential Superman. And this is really a time period. What year was the Superman movie? 78 or 77?
So I think it was 78.
Okay, so that Reeves Superman rippled through the comics. Yes, he was inspired by Golden Age and up until that point, Golden Age Superman. But his kind of just charm and take on that character, Christopher Reeves, defines it for DC for a very, very long period of Superman's history within the comics, and I think for the better. But God, yeah, I'm glad you called out that scene. When I was reading it, I loved it.
I love the new Teen Titans, and I love the Outsiders. Those are some fantastic runs, and it's very cool to see those characters here. At the same time, you're right. This is way out of their league.
And this is where we see villains start to take notice for the first time. Brainiac is like, wow, there's some crap hitting the fan here.
Yeah, this is a crazy... Brainiac experiences fear. I mean, that line at the bottom of page 10 is just very telling. So... This is a great Brainiac design, too.
And it kind of ends really highlighting the time displacement. We go to Earth X. We see the Freedom Fighters. Do we see them in this issue or not? Hold on. Maybe we don't see them yet.
So here we have...
it's the losers we have Sergeant Earth X.
We have Sergeant Rock. You have Sergeant Rock. You have the Haunted Tank.
Yeah. Again, there's some cheese in here.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, we don't get to the Freedom Fighters, even though they're going to be on Earth X. But it's just showing you the time not just the time displacement, but I think this issue really does a good job of not only establishing we're not only on different Earths, we're on different points in history within each of those given Earths, which at this point it's not a big deal. But once they all kind of start to come together, that's when this is really significant.
Yeah. Have the oh my gosh, the 30th century, what's the team? Legion.
Yeah.
You have the Legion that are at the beginning that are chasing down the woolly mammoths that oh my god, who's the guy that's at the beginning of Final Crisis? The
yeah. God, I have not read. I just got that omnibus, but I haven't read that since it came out. But I can see
the name. But it's like the caveman guy, and he sees the other city, and then you have all the Western characters, are ravaged and they disappear and stuff.
Yeah,
So, you see some stakes. I mean, you see how messed up things are here in this third issue. Really brings it together.
And then at the end, Solvar makes the ultimate sacrifice for, what was the character's name? Kamandi?
Yeah. The last boy on Earth.
And that's a really... Okay, so I have no emotional attachment at all to Solvar Kamandi, but that's a real, again, expression, just a really good way to end this kind of first quarter of this series. So
Solvar has one of my favorite lines. It's actually in the first book, though. It's in the first issue.
What's that?
And he's sitting there around with Dawnstar, and Dawnstar looks over at him. This is when the shadows are attacking them on board the Monitor satellite, and Dawnstar says something like, something about commenting that he's like he's a wise monkey, or he's an intelligent monkey or something. And King Solvar says, "And you're human with wings. Reality holds surprises for everyone." And it's a very fitting, way to kind of begin this, that there's all kinds of stuff that we just haven't seen before coming in this series.
And that's a fitting way to end this conversation on issues 1 through 3. And Jerry, you good to kind of get into our character spotlight?
Let's do it. Let's talk about the Batman.
All right, let's talk about the Caped Crusader here. So I just kind of have some questions I want to throw at you, and feel free to, throw any at me. We're not breaking down necessarily the history of Batman, first appearance, Detective Comics 27, all that stuff, sure. But this is more, we're going to be gushing a little bit, because I've been on record as saying Batman's been character 1A as far as my favorite superhero, and I believe that's the same for you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that.
So what I wanted to ask you is, what was your first exposure, first incarnation of Batman that you kind of gravitated toward?
I have vague memories of like having Batman and Robin pajamas as a kid. Having those pajama
Not
sets.
Not the movie version, like that, just character version, right?
This would have been like I said, this would have been the mid 80s for me. Yeah. 86, 87. So it's a time when I have vague memories of, remember the pajamas that had like Velcro and you'd put the cape on and stuff? I mean, I don't know. They may have been a little before your time. It was kind of like a big deal. I remember seeing Batman and Robin and things like, when they would meet Scooby-Doo, stuff like that. Seeing Super Friends on Saturday mornings, some of those cartoons that I wouldn't see very consistently because I was pretty young. So 89 Batman definitely makes a massive impression on me, even though I didn't see it in the theater. Suddenly, I mean, Batman is everywhere, and he's hard to ignore.
Yeah, the Batman fever in that summer of 89, I was too young to remember it, but it was, by all accounts, one of the biggest examples of movie hype that pop culture had seen up until that point. People who were, a little older than us back then still talk about that to this day.
I was between 5 and 6, and I remember it was Taco Bell. It seemed crazy because usually kids movies, but Taco Bell had stuff from the Batman movie and commercials everywhere. And I really wanted to watch it. I finally saw it when it was on video. I had the Toy Biz. Toy Biz actually did. They did Batman figures for the movie first, and then they did kind of a poor job, and so Kenner got the line and called it the Dark Knight Collection.
Was that the one with the gold card?
That was the one with the gold card.
Those are the ones I had as a kid, so those came later.
You had the Batman that had the pull-out belt with the string and stuff, and the Joker actually squirted water.
I had that. The Joker's top hat was removable.
Yep.
I actually lost the top hat to that Joker. It went down the bathtub drain. I remember
I still
that.
Have it somewhere, so.
Not my top hat he doesn't have. He has his, so just to clarify. So
you won't believe what washes up down here, Brad Bell.
I figured Joker, not Pennywise, would be the clowns we're talking about tonight. But my first exposure was, I think, even though I'm much, too young to compared to most people who have this first exposure to Batman, was the Batman 66 show. My grandfather would watch the reruns, and I remember vividly sitting on his lap and just that that iconic Batman and Robin running, biff, wham, pow, which over time you look back is cheesy, but there is a certain heart and just a nostalgia to it that it really conjures up a bunch of good memories for me. What was interesting is a love for Batman and superheroes, but Batman always really connected my grandfather and I too. Now, he liked things like Shazam, called him Captain Marvel, and Superman and things because he was buying those, Jerry, off the shelf.
I'm sure.
And he actually did hold on to a large chunk of his comic collection that my grandmother tossed out when they cleaned their attic.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So he was probably sitting on. I mean, who knows the condition they were in? I think he said that there was some even when they got thrown out, there had been like some water damage. But I mean, he had some of those original Golden Age books of Batman, Superman, Captain Marvel. But yeah, it's always linked in my head, that 66 Batman, with my relationship with my late grandfather. So I gotta say that it was this perfect trio for me of that, then 89, and then Batman the Animated Series.
Mm-hmm.
And which I think is the most balanced version of the character. Now it's still dark, it's still gritty, but there is some sillier villains on there like Scarface and it's Scarface, right? That's the puppet.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Scarface and the ventriloquist.
And the Clock King and the Gray Ghost. Like, even though there's these big heavy hitting episodes with Mark Hamill's Joker and stuff, and the Two-Face episodes, there's always kind of some time for those more outlandish villains. So to me, I think Batman and the new animated Batman Adventures really balance out Batman for me. Do you think, I wanted to ask you this. I was sitting here, I was thinking about this today. I've gotten to the Omnibus game. I really want to pick up, just to have them, the Batman Golden Age omnibuses. And I know, they don't read well, whatever, but just the idea of having those, and those were the issues that my grandfather read, and they're a piece of history. But is Batman kind of one of the only huge pop culture characters that you can think that kind of evolved and almost devolved? And here's what I mean by that. So he goes from being a kind of darker, grittier in those early issues of Detective and Batman to then getting a little cheesier when the 66 show especially is in its heyday. And then, of course, when the late Denny O'Neil comes in and does Batman, he brings it kind of all full circle and introduces a lot of that. He doesn't introduce it, but he really plays up a lot of that detective work. Mm-hmm. So Batman almost kind of goes full circle. I'm not saying the first issues of Detective, I've read some of those, are like dark and gritty, but they are a lot darker and grittier than what will come in the 60s and Batman, the early 60s and 50s of Batman. Am I wrong? And what do you think?
Remind me of the question again.
Okay, so is Batman...
I get the gist. What's the question?
Is Batman kind of... Did he go full circle? So he started out dark and gritty, and then he gets campy with the TV show, and then the comics come back around with Denny O'Neil and, of course, later Frank Miller and stuff, to getting darker again. And I realize the Miller stuff's on a whole new level of dark and gritty, but...
I think Batman is almost... I mean, maybe it's because of the love people have for the character, but I feel like he is so... He just... constantly can readapt to different things. Now, that there are some Batman things that I absolutely despise. Two films in particular. Two films and one graphic novel. But overall, I mean, Batman has constantly adapted. I mean, you look at, the early comics. I mean, Batman is he's fitting right in with that, those masked Avengers, characters like the Shadow, Doc Savage, the Spider. I mean, Batman is very much a product of those, that time and those characters more so than he even feels like a regular superhero. And then he starts going the superhero road. He has Robin, it becomes more levity. I mean, kids are involved. You get into the 60s and you get those crazy things. And I don't feel like it's the 66 series being cheesy. The 66 series was almost perfectly adapting what Batman looked like during that era.
So you think it was more
what he was.
It was the 66 show is more kind of derivative of the Batman comics of the 60s than the comics
That is
were.
what Batman
Okay.
was like in the 60s. And I mean, you had I mean, if you watch the show, like I mean, you get that it's silly, but it is so tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
It is so tongue-in-cheek that it makes it funny. It's kind of like when you can, everybody knows how crazy things are, and Adam West was a perfect straight man. I mean, he played that role. He played an excellent Batman in a crazy world, and it worked out. But then you have Batman go into the 80s, and he gets darker and darker. But, I mean, again, Batman the Animated Series is a great thing, but it lightens up Batman in some ways. I mean, it was a Saturday morning cartoon, but it worked. Batman survived the Schumacher era,
Barely, but
don't like to speak.
It did.
But he absolutely did. And I mean, Batman continues to, be triumphant. I think that was the name of the 5th film, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They were planning the Batman Triumphant.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah, like where Scarecrow was going to be the bad guy, who, of course, ended up
Jeff
being...
Goldblum is the Scarecrow. I've heard people talk about. I think Batman adapts. I think Batman works perfectly when he is dark, when he is gritty. Batman works in Arkham. He works in The Killing Joke. He works in Dark Knight Returns. Batman works when you have something like 66 or The Brave and the Bold.
Yeah.
I mean, it works. It's fantastic. And there's something about the character that is so... As long as you get Batman himself as being pretty serious and straight, you can almost do everything around him can be as crazy and dark or crazy and light as you want. If you nail the Batman character well, if you capture his voice.
How do you prefer Batman? Dark and gritty, campy, or somewhere in between?
I like the somewhere in between. Some of my favorite versions of Batman. Now, granted, I mean, I absolutely love, The Dark Knight Returns and Year One. But again, I feel like the Kevin Conroy Batman that starts in Batman the Animated Series, but that goes through the Arkhamverse games.
Yeah.
I love that Batman. I mean, he is serious, but he is this moral center as well. I mean, he is this loner at times, but he is the head of this unusual family. I like that Batman that has allies and comes to realize that that's strength. That's a father figure to Dick and Tim and Jason, at the same time as he's also this brooding character, and these are both parts of who he is.
And I think in the comics you see a lot more of that somewhere in between the camp and the dark and grittiness, and that's kind of what we associate with Batman is that perfect balance. If you read a lot of even the modern comics, but on screen, which is most people's exposure to the character who don't read these comic books like we do, or these trades, omnibuses, graphic novels, what have you, they've never really hit the in-between. We've seen the campy and we've seen the, I mean, Batman Forever is a little in-between, but it's still campy, man.
Yeah, if you're talking the best in-between, I mean, I really think it's the Tim Burton films,
Yeah.
There's,
I don't know. Batman Returns. I can see that argument with 89, but there's some dark writing in Batman Returns.
It is a dark movie. But I mean, there's still parts of Batman's character that are a little strange. I definitely think 89 more so.
Yeah.
I mean, watch how Bruce Wayne acts in those.
You want to get nuts?
Let's get nuts. How do you know it's Japanese? Because I bought it in Japan. So.
Never rub another man's rhubarb.
Now that's the joke.
I know.
It's not something that Bruce says. But
he should have said that. Oh, man. So, speaking of the Joker, Batman, I mean, Spider-Man's always a close second when we discuss this, but he has the best rogues gallery in all of comics. And I think that, along with not just the rogues gallery, but his Bat family, as you mentioned, is what elevates him to time and time again being the character who attracts the best writers, the best artists, when you're talking about the comics, when you're talking about the movies, some of the best actors and best directors, just because there's so much great character interaction and dialogue you can write with the people surrounding Batman, who are really more interesting a lot of times than the Batman is himself, and are always almost kind of warped versions of Batman, I think, is what really makes it interesting.
I agree. And the thing about Batman, you mentioned in the Crisis conversation that, a lot of these street level fighters, Batman and the Outsiders and, whatnot, were just, they weren't able to deal with this crisis. They didn't have the power. I think that's the thing that makes Batman interesting is, you can give Batman all kinds of gadgets. You can make him a great fighter, a great detective. Batman is always prepared for everything, and you can have him defeat any villain and make it believable. But at the same time, a group of normal street-level thugs can still be an adversary for Batman. Because, the Bat family are, they're human.
Yeah.
They're human. They're not, super skilled. They are super skilled, but they're not, invincible. They don't have superpowers. And I think that makes it interesting. When you have a character who's really powerful, you have to keep upping the stakes. You can take Batman to a more detective-based route, have, a clever enemy, and it works for him. It gives him something new. But yes, he does have the greatest group of villains of all. And it's interesting how many of Batman's villains have gone to become, heroes or anti-heroes as well. They become, major characters in their own right, growing outside of Batman's shadow. Look at Harley Quinn. Look at Catwoman.
Clayface and James Tynion's detective run.
Yeah, look at the way that there's so much character growth there. It's interesting.
And the interesting thing about the Rogues Gallery that Batman offers is, unlike some other Rogues Gallery like The Flash and even Spider-Man to a certain extent, it's continued to grow and evolve. You have the Court of Owls, and who was the main leader of the Court of Owls? Talon. You have Talon.
The Talons, yeah.
Of course, you had Hush.
One of the Talons had his own series. And
you had Hush. That was a newer, and just these continual contributions to these new Batman villains, whereas the latter Spider-Man villains, they never quite hit the mark. It seems like the latter Batman villains do. One of the Spot in Spider-Man, you don't remember him as being a great Spider-Man villain, whereas you do remember somebody like Hush, or if you read the comics, like Talon being a pretty good villain. So my answer to this. I'll humor you with it, but I'm going to ask you first. What's your favorite? I asked you your first exposure to Batman, but your favorite incarnation of Batman.
My favorite incarnation of Batman. That's such a hard question.
You previously said the Arkham games in the past.
That was what I was going to say.
Yeah.
The Arkham game to me still has everything. It's Batman in his prime. He's not young, inexperienced. He's not, old and coming back. But it's Batman in a perfect time for him. You got the Bat family. You have Kevin Conroy's voice. That would probably be my favorite incarnation of Batman. I will say, to throw out a couple more unusual ones out there, one of my favorite costumes is from Frank Miller's All-Star Batman. The book is crazy.
That is a crazy book, man.
It's not great. It's not good. But I do like the look of that Batman. I love the look of that Batman in that series. Jim Lee did the art on that, correct?
Yeah, Jim Lee did.
Yeah, that's a fantastic look for Batman.
So my favorite Batman suit is the blue Batman, with the blue sheen Batman Forever sonar suit. That's my favorite bat suit.
I'm just shaking my head.
It is, man. It is. I know. But my favorite version of the character is the Nolan take on the character. And I'm not saying Christian Bale's the best Batman. I think Keaton is the best on-screen Batman. But the Nolan verse is, now I think it kind of ruined some stuff moving forward with superhero movies, is everything kind of wanted to be like the Nolan verse. Look at Man of Steel. I don't hate that movie, but I think it's a little too derivative of what came before with the Nolan Batman movies. But man, just the where I was at in my life, just like how those movies resonated with me. The Heath Ledger Joker. I mean, I don't need to go into it between you and I get that this is a new podcast, but if people who know about me know that I love these movies dearly. The Dark Knight's my all-time favorite movie. I get that it's just continuous and nonstop, and that turns a lot of people off. But the appeal of Batman to me has always been, this could happen. This could be a real man. I mean, not really, but it could be.
There's some, like, again, there's some grain of believability there compared to most other superheroes.
And the Nolan movie hits that grain of believability. Like, I think it shows that grain of believability better than any other take on the character. Jerry, what's your favorite Batmobile?
I really like the 89 Batmobile.
Yeah,
that's a great Batmobile.
That's mine too.
Especially the one from Batman Returns that can lose the sides and go through narrow alleys. That is a fantastic Batmobile. Here's another weird version, though, that I have always loved. There was a toy line that Kenner did in the 90s, probably around 94, that was called Legends of Batman. And it was kind of an Elseworlds inspired, and they did this beautiful, it's like a whitish, grayish white Batmobile. And I mean, it is like very sharp, lots of angles. It is a fantastic looking Batmobile. You gotta check this out. I still have it. I love it.
So that's different from the Legends of the Dark Knight line that had like
that is different than Legends of the Dark Knight. Yeah, that was a later line that's very influenced by Spawn.
Yeah,
because the characters are oversized and very, exaggerated proportions.
I had the Bane from that line.
Yeah, the Bane is really cool from that line. But this line was very, like the different Batmans. I mean, there's like a Batman who's a gladiator, and there's some great regular versions of Batman too. There's some wonderful, like, dark, Nightfall inspired figures and stuff. No Bane, oddly enough. But there's like a great, I think they call him Night Quest Batman, or Night's End Batman, but it's clearly Azrael. But fantastic. It's a cool Batmobile. I would say that one and the Batman Returns Batmobile.
Okay, I'm gonna put you on the spot here with this one, and then we'll kind of begin to wrap up this first episode of a tour of the DC Universe. What is your favorite? It can be a run, it can be a single storyline. What is your favorite run or storyline of Batman in the comics?
I would say Nightfall. Just that whole story. I mean, when you go back and start that story, maybe even from Venom, I mean, that is just some of the best writing. It's fantastic take on Batman. Absolutely love that whole run. I've read it through a few times. I mean, all the tie-in stuff, and I love it.
I love Nightfall as well. Man, this is a really tough one, and this wasn't in the show notes. I just came up with that question off the top of my head. I mean,
That's a good question.
I love Hush. I love Long Halloween. The go-tos, right? Dark Knight Returns. But man, the The one that really, really has stuck with me, and it's a shame I don't own it. I didn't pick up this omnibus, and I sold my singles, is the Scott Snyder Batman. The Capullo Snyder New 52 Batman, but specifically the Court of the Owls, Night of the Owls, and going into Death of the Family. You and I actually reviewed Death of the Family 17 on an old episode of the
when
Confirmed
it was coming
Epic
out
podcast. Yeah,
like it was when it just finished.
There's not many books that I made. I went to the shop on Wednesday when I was buying singles at Collector's World in Gastonia, North Carolina. Shout out to Jim. He actually bought my single issues, by the way. But and I wanted to see the conclusion. And I'd seen a million and read a million Batman and Joker stories, obviously exaggerating there, but I'd read a ton and saw a ton. But the fact that here is a Batman and Joker story at its core, and you got me this much on the edge of my seat when at that point I was in my 20s. I don't know, man. I thought there was something just very, very special about it. Long Halloween's very close. I think that's going to be like a close second to me.
I wanted to throw Batman Incorporated out there too, because I loved that idea, and I thought that was a great example of a Batman who was in his prime, but at like this level of maturity where, he was moving beyond himself as the be-all, end-all. I thought that was a great run, and actually another one of my favorite costumes, Batman Incorporated.
Do you have a like, if I told you, besides like Bob Kane or something, if you could get a sketch of Batman from any comic book artist to put up in your office there, anyone off the top of your head? I mean, mine would be Jim Lee. I know that's probably an obvious one, but I would love to have a Jim Lee Batman sketch.
I would probably go with Mike Mignola.
Yeah, that's great.
It's not my favorite version of Batman, but I love Mike Mignola's artwork, and I do like his work on Batman. So Neil Adams.
Jerry, you could get that at HeroCon for about $300-$400.
Yeah, I know.
So I mean, that's all I have for this first ever edition of the Tour of the DC Universe, the new Tour of the DC Universe podcast. Jerry, is there anything you want to say before we close it out here this evening?
I'm thinking. No, I'm excited. I'm really excited I'm really excited to get to some of the crossovers that, aren't as well known, but I feel like this is a good way for us to lay the groundwork.
Yeah.
To kind of get back into the swing of it. Just, for full disclosure, you called me the doctor of DC, and I would say, I am a master's level at best.
All right, we'll rebrand you the Master of the Multiverse. How about that?
Master of the Multiverse. I have not focused on DC as much over the past, few years. Just because it was just too much.
But I think through the New 52, though,
I was definitely, and I definitely read a lot of Rebirth. And I've been on and off, but I am excited to go through these and to look at them story by story. DC Comics is probably my third favorite. I would say it's probably my third favorite fandom kind of thing. For me, it's behind
Masters and what else?
Behind Star Wars and Masters of the Universe. DC's probably like my third favorite.
I would say for me, I mean, it's so weird. I've always been a Marvel guy. As I've got older, I've gravitated more toward DC, which is just kind of weird. You think it would kind of be the opposite. I don't know why. I think a lot of it has to do with I've read so many Marvel stories, and I just know the ins and outs, and I've read all the big events. Like if I pulled up the Marvel events, I could be like Reddit, but that's not the case with DC. So yeah. I think that's what interests me about doing this podcast. And of course, if you count Batman as a fandom, I mean, that's up there for me as well.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think this is going to be a lot of fun. As far as the show, again, find us on iTunes by searching for A Tour of the DC Universe. Instagram and Twitter at DCU Tour Pod. Like us on Facebook, just search DCU Tour Pod. Remember to email the show anytime at dcutourpod@gmail.com. The best way to get people to know about this show is to rate and review on iTunes. So if you're listening to this on iTunes, give us a rating, hopefully a good one. Leave a comment. Let us know why you like the show, and that would just mean so much to us. And we're on YouTube as well. Just search DCU Tour Pod. Jerry, where can people find more of you on the internet?
Keep checking me out at actionfigurebarbecue.com. That's BARBECUE.com, where I, review lots of stuff. I mostly review Masters of the Universe toys, but, I review a lot of other stuff as well. Star Wars Black Series and things like that. A lot of older toy lines. I've been doing a focus every month for the last few months. Back in May was Moss May, so I reviewed lots of Moss Band toys from Masters of the Universe. Last month for June was June Adventures, so I reviewed lots of toys from different incarnations of the New Adventures of He-Man. And this month is Trap July, so I'm reviewing lots of Trapjaw based toys from Masters of the Universe for Trap July. So
and gearing up for hokey Halloween horror coming
I
up.
have already written my first review for 31 Days of Toy Terror, and working on the second because it takes a lot of work to have 31 toy reviews ready in a month.
Yeah.
In addition to all the other stuff I review. So
as for me, find me on Twitter at The Real Brad Bell, REEL Brad Bell. I'm trying to do some YouTube videos to go along with this podcast too. I have one out today, just kind of breaking down this 35th anniversary deluxe hardcover edition, talking about the contents, quality of the paper, things of that nature. Again, on Twitter at The Real Brad Bell. That's the REEL Brad Bell. And as the great Barbara Gordon said, people, remember to be your own damn hero.
Our darkness was deep and soon to swallow all hope. But these heroes were here the whole time to remind us that hope is real, that you can see it